In today's video, we will be looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went terribly wrong. The first story, in particular, highlights the incredible lengths a true friend will go to save someone they deeply care about. But will that love be enough? And for the other 2, well, they are even more painful to watch. As always, viewer discretion advised. In March 1997, 2 friends, Andrew and Attila, planned on a caving expedition. The anticipation had been building for weeks. They had been planning their trip to Real Well in Tennessee with growing excitement, eager to face the thrill of descending its infamous 160-foot entrance pit. Both had a few caving trips under their belts, though Attila, at 26, was still relatively new to the sport. He had visited only 5 caves previously, but his enthusiasm more than made up for his lack of experience. Andrew, 32 and more seasoned, took the lead in their planning, and they felt confident they had what it took to handle whatever the cave threw at them. Or so they thought. The morning of March 18th arrived with overcast skies and a persistent drizzle. As they approached the cave entrance, they could hear the ominous roar of the water cascading into the pit, louder than expected. Andrew paused, glancing over at Attila, who stood next to the ropes and equipment they had laid out by the mouth of the cave. They had their wetsuits in the car, but looking at the weather and the cold air around them, neither thought they'd need them. The decision to leave those wetsuits behind would become one of many critical mistakes. Despite the waterfall's intensity, they pressed on. Their excitement, perhaps arrogance, dulled their instincts to reconsider. They rigged their ropes directly in the waterfall's path, knowing they'd get wet, but underestimating how quickly the cold would overtake them. Attila, in his rush, hadn't brought a helmet, another crucial oversight, but at the time, the thrill of the descent overpowered thoughts of safety. Andrew rappelled down first, feeling the sting of the cold water hitting his back as he slid deeper into the pit. The waterfall was relentless, a torrent crashing around him, soaking his clothes and skin. By the time he hit the bottom, he was already chilled to the bone. Attila followed soon after, the water pounding down even harder, making the rope feel like a slippery serpent between his gloved hands. Inside the cave, the air was thick with moisture, the walls damp and gleaming in the faint light of their headlamps. The cave was beautiful, but the cold gnawed at them from the start. After only about 30 minutes of exploring, Attila began to feel uneasy. His body was trembling, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the cold seeped in deeper. "Andrew, I can't stay down here," Attila said, his voice strained and weak, the discomfort apparent. "I think I need to get out." Andrew nodded, understanding that things were quickly going south. "All right, I'll get the ropes ready," he said, his voice steady despite his own discomfort. But the waterfall continued to roar, and even his hands, trained from years of experience, were starting to stiffen from the cold. Attila rigged his climbing system quickly, too quickly in hindsight. His setup consisted of a commercial seat harness and a hand-tied chest harness. Inexperienced as he was, he relied on a Petzl-handled ascender, which is designed to grip the rope as climbers move upward, with a cow's tail sling attaching it to his harness. Unfortunately, his cow's tail was far too long, which would soon spell disaster. He also used a Petzl shunt, a mechanical device meant to be a backup safety device, but it too would complicate things. To make matters worse, Attila had rigged a chain of 6 non-locking carabiners to connect his seat ascender to his harness, another dangerous improvisation. Andrew noticed the hurried, jumbled setup and thought about saying something, but before he could, Attila was already on the rope, beginning his ascent. Each handhold was a battle against the freezing water streaming over him, his gear slick with moisture. The waterfall battered him relentlessly as he climbed, making his progress slow and exhausting. The shunt, which he had attached to a long foot sling, was giving him problems. It kept slipping, refusing to hold steady as it should. Halfway up, Attila stopped. His muscles were burning, and the cold had sapped much of his strength. His gear was failing him, piece by piece. The long chain of carabiners connecting his ascender had unhooked, leaving him suspended by the cow's tail, now stretched so far that he couldn't even reach the ascender to adjust it. He tried to communicate with Andrew, shouting through the deluge of water, but his words were swallowed by the deafening roar of the waterfall. "Attila, come back down if you need to," Andrew shouted from below, his voice barely reaching over the torrent. Attila tried to respond, but his words came out garbled, unclear. Minutes stretched into agonizing minutes, the water hammering him, the cold tightening its grip on his body. Finally, Andrew heard him call out, "I can't!" Andrew's heart raced. Attila was stuck, trapped in the waterfall with no way to free himself. Realizing how dire the situation had become, Andrew knew he had to act fast. Without hesitation, he clipped into the rope and began climbing up toward his friend. The ascent was grueling. Every foot he gained felt like a victory as the freezing water sapped his energy and his hands went numb against the wet rope. When Andrew reached Attila, the sight was grim. His friend was hanging limp in his harness, conscious but unable to move, his body nearly paralyzed by the cold. Hypothermia was already setting in, the signs unmistakable, the uncontrollable shivering, the pale skin, the lethargy. Andrew knew that the only way to save Attila was to perform a pick-off maneuver, a technical and often life-saving rescue technique in which the rescuer attaches the stranded climber to their own harness and descends with them to the ground. But under these conditions, with the waterfall pounding down on them and both of them freezing, it was far more difficult than in any training scenario. Andrew struggled to get his gear in place, his fingers numb and clumsy from the cold. He tried to attach Attila to his harness, but each attempt was thwarted by the relentless water and his dwindling strength. He knew the maneuver in theory, had practiced it a handful of times, but never in such extreme conditions. His muscles screamed with effort, his mind growing foggy as hypothermia crept into his own body. After several failed attempts, Andrew realized it wasn't going to work. Desperate, he tried another tactic, climbing out while tethered to Attila. If he could pull his friend up, maybe they could reach safety together. But the added weight was too much. After ascending only 15 feet, Andrew's strength gave out, his body shaking violently from exhaustion and the cold. He couldn't go any further. Now both of them were stuck, hanging in the freezing waterfall. Time was running out, and Andrew knew it. Attila was slipping further into unconsciousness, and Andrew's own body was on the verge of giving in. In one last desperate act, Andrew swung himself over to a ledge, fighting the overwhelming cold and the fatigue that threatened to overtake him. He managed to pull himself onto the ledge and unclip from the rope, collapsing into a trembling heap. His entire body was convulsing from the cold, his clothes soaked through, offering no protection against the elements. He crawled to a drier part of the ledge, his vision blurring, and before he knew it, he passed out. When Andrew finally awoke, hours had passed. His body was stiff and numb, his mind groggy and disoriented. But the reality of the situation came crashing down on him as soon as he saw Attila. His friend was still hanging in the waterfall, motionless. Andrew's stomach twisted with grief, but he knew what had to be done. He re-rigged his equipment, his hands shaking uncontrollably, barely able to manipulate the gear. With a heavy heart, he cut the tether that connected Attila to him. It was clear that his friend was gone. Andrew made the agonizing climb out of the cave alone, every step filled with the weight of what had happened. When he finally emerged, he collapsed and called for help. Rescue teams arrived hours later, finding Attila's body still suspended in the waterfall. A doctor on the scene confirmed what Andrew already knew. Attila had succumbed to hypothermia hours earlier. His makeshift climbing system, the cold and the harsh conditions had been too much. Looking back, it was clear that mistakes had been made from the start. Leaving the wetsuits behind, Attila's unsafe cobbled-together climbing gear, and their lack of experience with such a wet, vertical cave had all contributed to the tragedy. The fatal error was likely when one of the non-locking carabiners in Attila's chain of gear had come undone, leaving him stranded, unable to reach his ascender or his safety devices. This next story shows how one small mistake can lead to a sequence of worse events one after the other, no less than a nightmare. Along the stunning coastline of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula lies a world hidden beneath the surface. Sistema Sac Actun. It's a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers stretching over 368 kilometers and is the longest underwater cave system in the world. In December 2004, 9 divers set out to explore Cenote, Kalimba, part of this vast underwater network. These were seasoned divers, their skills honed from previous dives. They had built trust, communication, and a camaraderie that made them feel invincible. Yet Sistema Sac Actun, with its twists, turns, and hidden dangers, was about to put them to the ultimate test. As the divers arrived that morning, the sun bathed the lush greenery in gold. its warmth in stark contrast to the cool, dark waters awaiting them below. They gathered by the water's edge, checking their equipment with the precision of astronauts before a space mission. Breathing regulators, tanks, spools of rope, and the brightly colored cookies, small plastic markers used to mark paths, were all checked and rechecked. Each diver knew the importance of these tools. In an environment where visibility could be reduced to inches, they were lifelines. The plan was clear. 2 teams would enter. Team A, led by a guide, would descend first and lay markers along the way. Team B would follow closely behind, retracing their steps back once they reached a predetermined point. The divers nodded in agreement, confidence radiating from each of them. They had been through tougher dives, and this one seemed manageable. Average depths of 33 feet, moderate currents, and well-traveled paths. But the Cenote didn't care about their plans. Team A entered the water first, the crystal-clear entrance of Cenote Kalimba giving way to murky depths as they ventured further. The stillness of the cave was broken only by the rhythmic bubbles of their breathing. Following the permanent guideline, they marked their path carefully, knowing that even one wrong turn could lead to catastrophe. Soon, they reached the first intersection. The diver in the lead fixed a yellow cookie to the jump line, marking the safe path for Team B. With the path marked, they continued forward, their movements smooth and synchronized. Everything was going according to plan. Meanwhile, Team B had entered the water. As they followed Team A's path, they reached the first intersection and saw the marker, a reassuring sign that they were on the right track. But unbeknownst to them, a storm of mistakes was brewing. After 32 minutes of travel, Team B arrived at the second marker. Here, they made a critical error. Instead of turning right to follow the path back to the exit, they turned left. It seemed innocent enough. After all, directional markers in the cave pointed them that way. And it was easy to mistake one dark tunnel for another. As they swam deeper into the cave system, the mood began to shift. The cool calmness that had guided their movements was replaced with confusion and an unsettling realization. They weren't where they thought they were. They'd been swimming for 25 minutes since the wrong turn, covering 1,400 feet, deeper into the cave system, away from the exit. Panic began to creep into their minds. The water around them grew colder as tiny particles of silt were disturbed by their frantic movements. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the lines between up, down, and sideways blurred into a disorienting fog. It felt like the cave was swallowing them whole. Back at the surface, Team A had finished their dive. The first to exit, they removed the markers they had placed, unaware that Team B was still inside and hopelessly lost. Meanwhile, Team B found themselves deeper than intended. They paused at an intersection, realizing their mistake too late. One diver unspooled a rope, hoping to find the next permanent line, but his search led to nothing but rock and shadow. They were running out of time, and worse, running out of air. The divers split into 2 pairs, hoping to find their way back. The lead pair swam ahead, searching for the familiar markers they had seen on the way in. When they reached the intersection where they had gone wrong, they were met with a horrifying sight. No marker, no path to follow, only cold, oppressive darkness. Their hearts raced as the cold reality set in. They were lost. And with panic came another problem. Their air consumption skyrocketed. With each frantic breath, they burned through their tanks faster. It wasn't long before one of the divers found his tank running dangerously low. In a desperate move, he began buddy breathing with his partner, sharing what little air remained between them. At the surface, Team A realized something was terribly wrong. Team B was nowhere to be found, and too much time had passed. Grabbing extra tanks, the guide and several divers plunged back into the water, their hearts pounding with urgency. The search didn't take long. Just 250 feet from the safety of the surface, they found the first pair from Team B, barely alive, gas tanks almost empty, but safe. When asked where the other 2 were, the lead pair, now gasping for breath, said they had seen the lights of their teammates not far behind. But after waiting a few more agonizing minutes, there was still no sign of the second pair. The rescuers dove back into the cave, hoping against hope that they would find their teammates alive. And then, in the dim glow of their flashlights, they saw them. 2 lifeless figures, suspended near the cave's ceiling, regulators floating useless beside them. The rescuers gently pulled the bodies from the cave, Their dive tanks, when checked, showed zero pressure. They had suffocated in the very cave they had come to explore. The Sistema Sac Actun, with its winding passages and silent depths, is a place of wonder, but also a place where nature is unforgiving. For Team B, one simple navigational error cascaded into a series of fatal events, showing that even the most skilled and experienced divers are at the mercy of the elements in this vast underwater world. The last story involves not one, but 19 lives at stake. The group of 31 adventurers gathered early one chilly January morning in 1970, bundled up against the biting winter air. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way to Knox Cave. Knox Cave had a reputation for its most notorious feature, the Gunbarrel. The Gunbarrel was a keyhole-shaped tunnel, just 18 inches wide and 60 feet long, that squeezed anyone brave enough to enter. For many, crawling through this impossibly tight space was a badge of honor. It separated casual explorers from those truly willing to push their limits. Most of the group was determined to pass through the Gunbarrel and reach the untouched sections of the cave that lay beyond. It was the ultimate test, both physically and mentally. After hiking through the snow-filled forest, the group arrived at the entrance, a snow-covered sinkhole leading into the cave's cold, dark mouth. One by one, they descended into the depths, the temperature dropping as they left the world of light behind. The atmosphere inside the cave was eerie, with only the sound of dripping water and the soft scuffling of boots on rock to accompany them. 19 of the group decided to tackle the Gunbarrel, among them 14-year-old Peter Viennes. It was Peter's first caving trip, and he was eager to prove himself. He watched as the others entered the tight passage ahead of him, crawling on their bellies through the narrow opening. Some moved quickly, confident in their ability, while others hesitated, inching forward cautiously. When it was Peter's turn, he took a deep breath and plunged in. The tunnel was tighter than anything he had ever imagined. His body scraped against the rough, jagged rock walls as he wriggled forward, using his elbows and knees to inch along. The air was thin, and his breathing was shallow. Every few feet, he paused to catch his breath, the weight of the rock pressing in on him. He was just 8 feet from the exit when disaster struck. As Peter pushed himself forward, his knee slipped into a narrow crevice in the floor. At first, he thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd pull it free and keep going. But when he tried to yank it out, his knee wouldn't budge. Panic gripped him. He tried again, twisting and pulling, but each attempt only made things worse. His knee was stuck fast, wedged in the rock. Peter called out, his voice shaking with fear. The group ahead of him, unaware of his predicament, kept moving forward until one by one, they realized something was wrong. Shouts echoed through the cave as they called back to him. When Peter explained his situation, the group quickly turned around, but they soon realized they were in a terrible situation themselves. Peter's body was blocking the narrow tunnel, preventing anyone from moving forward or backward. They were trapped. The attempts to free Peter began almost immediately. The cavers tried pulling on his leg, twisting it, shifting his body, but nothing worked. Every tug caused Peter to cry out in pain, and eventually, they had to stop. The group was stuck in the cold, cramped tunnel, with no way forward and no way back. Time passed slowly, and the cave's natural chill began to seep into their bones. The temperature was dropping, and hypothermia became a very real threat. The cavers could do nothing but wait, huddling together for warmth and comfort in the narrow passage. The younger members of the group, especially Peter, were terrified, while the older cavers tried their best to stay calm and keep the situation under control. Outside the cave, the rest of the group grew anxious. Hours had passed with no sign of the others returning, and something felt wrong. One of them decided to venture into the cave to check on the others, and when he reached the Gunbarrel, he was horrified by what he found. Peter was trapped, and the rest of the group was stuck behind him. He quickly rushed back to the surface to raise the alarm. By the time police officers and firefighters arrived at the scene, it was already late afternoon. The rescuers examined the situation and realized that this was no ordinary cave rescue. The narrowness of the Gunbarrel made it impossible for them to simply pull Peter free, and any sudden movements could cause him severe injury. Hours dragged on as they tried various methods to lift his leg out of the crevice, but nothing worked. At one point, Peter, delirious with fear and exhaustion, began screaming about a snake biting him, though there was no snake, just his mind playing tricks in the dark, cold cave. As the sun set, the situation became increasingly desperate. The temperature inside the cave was dropping dangerously low, and if they couldn't free Peter soon, the cold could claim not just him, but the others trapped behind him. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., after 7 long hours of struggle, the rescuers came up with a new plan. They handed a thermos of soapy water down to the group, hoping to lubricate Peter's knee and free it from the crevice. Slowly, they poured the soapy water around his leg, and the firefighters tied a rope around his ankle. This time, they coordinated their efforts with the group inside the cave, carefully pulling on Peter's leg while those inside wriggled beside him, easing the pressure on his knee. Finally, Peter's knee began to shift. With one last gentle pull, it popped free from the crevice. Relief washed over everyone, but they couldn't celebrate yet. Peter was still in a dangerous position, and they had to make sure he didn't slip back into the slot. Carefully, they guided him the rest of the way through the tight passage until he was finally clear. The group behind him was then able to crawl out to safety, one by one, exhausted but unharmed. Peter's leg sustained fractures and bruises. He was treated for hypothermia, and then admitted for a few days so that his leg could make a full recovery.